So let us see how we started our morning. We started our morning with representatives from the Ministry of Trade and Industry. We moved on to the president of the Supermarket Association, and this was all in the area of the new price schedule and the supermarket prices at that level. It all locks into our culminating discussion, which is about the recession. Our discussion with Mr. Conrad Enil is always anxiously awaited because he was a former minister and he also is a lecturer. He looks at this situation, he's an analyst, and he understands what we are looking at. First of all, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's good to have you back again. If you would get just a little closer to that microphone for me, I would appreciate that. I want to begin with the foundation, the energy sector specifically. We are going to go into details, listeners. In this hour, we're going to details as to how it affects you at the table. But before you get to the table, you have to deal with the foundation. Let's deal with the foundation. Oil prices. We've had a good week, relatively speaking, or comparatively speaking. Oil prices at one point hit just above $45. I think it closed the week somewhere at about $43. But this vacillating situation is nothing you can bank on. The head of the Economic Advisory Committee, Dr. Farrell, said that we are to expect it going between $30 and $45. This is what is anticipated for the future. Is that in your eyes or through your eyes what you are seeing will happen in the next 2 years?
The conversation needs to start, first of all, with an understanding of what we're talking about. Prices by itself has absolutely no impact on the Trinidad and Tobago situation. It really doesn't, simply because the oil companies operate in a regime that determines the amount of money that they pay to the government. And therefore, during this particular period, even if the price went to $100, given the current fiscal regime, the government will get no income. And I think that that's the first thing that we need to clarify in this conversation, that while today we have a problem, the problem is short-term in the first instance. And the problem is not a new problem. This is how oil and gas behaves. What is different, though, is that over the last couple of years, we have been spending more than we are earning. And the problem that we face today is not so much the price of oil or the price of gas, but our ability to satisfy our expenditure because our revenue on oil and gas has disappeared.
All right, I could get there in a moment, Mr. Enil. I want to stay in this area of the regime you mentioned where the country will not benefit with revenue regardless of if the prices go up and down. Detail that for me, please.
The last administration, in trying to get the oil companies to actually spend more on plant and equipment, gave them an incentive where for 2016, 2017, and 2018, any money that they spend, a portion of it will be written off against taxes.
This is any money they spent for exploration.
This is any money that is spent in maintenance and in capital expenditure. So what has happened is that when the price of oil and gas is low, and they are spending money, they are able to write off that against the revenue. And therefore, the tax liability to the government becomes zero. In 2016, based on the information that is in the public domain, the cost of that is $6 billion. So we are dealing with a situation where the difference between expenditure and revenue is being dealt with by borrowings. However, the impact of oil and gas not contributing to the revenue stream will be felt in the exchange rate. Because generally the oil and gas companies would pay the government
In U.S. currency.
in U.S. currency. And therefore what that would do is that would buffer, if you will, the exchange rate. When you take that out of the situation and you are still internally spending at the rate that the government is spending, therefore your demand for consumers continues, then you're going to feel it in the exchange rate, both in terms of the price and in terms of availability.
All right, I'll continue down that line, but as you go, I'm going to ask you to make some quick stops here. You say that this agreement, this concession rather, that was given is for 2 years. Am I accurate?
I think it is 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018.
2018. So whatever happens with oil and gas, essentially you're saying the cost of doing business by these oil companies will be put against what they're in fact taking in and or selling, and which means it comes down to zero, so we get no money over that period.
That's what the Minister of Finance has said.
All right, so that is an issue we have.
So, and it's in that context, Rennie, the point is made that it really doesn't matter what the price of the product is. The only issue with the price of oil is that to the extent that Petrotrain has to import it for the transportation sector, it means that with a higher price of oil, the subsidy is going to increase.
Yes.
So the cost is going to increase. That's the implication for changes in the price of oil.
Right up until 2018 is what we're looking at. So we get into the area that everyone, including Dr. Farrell, Dr. Marlene Atz, and just about every economist has said, well, you're looking at your spending and you're looking at your revenue.
Yes.
You are going to, in fact, be talking in the area of curbing your spending because you must. The divide is way too great. You are looking at serious dislocation coming of this because a number of government projects will have to be shelved and or seriously curtailed. Speak to me to the impact of that with no new revenue coming, even though we may see some things happening with oil and gas prices. No money's coming in there. You've got to shrink that expenditure, but there's going to be dislocation. Let's speak about employment.
I think that the government is between a rock and a hard place, and whatever decisions they make will impact somebody. Certainly, they can borrow to meet the gap. We're at 40, the expenditure is 60, they can borrow 20. But even as you borrow, some of the things that you are going to do will impact the cost of your borrowings. So, for example, if you went and you took money out of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and if you brought your reserves down from 11 months, where it is now, to 6 months, where I think it will go, given what is taking place, then it means that foreign investors looking at your country will ask the question, does this country have the ability to repay my debt over the long term? And if it does not, then I will either shorten it or I would increase the rate and therefore put a risk premium on it. And therefore it means the cost of doing business goes up at a time when you shouldn't really be picking up additional cost. So the challenge that the government faces really is how do you hold on to the country during this period of adjustment. And my own view is that the adjustment between 2016, 2017, and 2018 is the critical area that the country has to survive. And to me, that is where a lot of the pain can emanate.
And that is what I'm trying to understand here, because we're talking about $20 billion. You're talking about using the Heritage Civilization Fund. That's one angle. You're talking about doing some borrowing. But as you said, the more you borrow, the more you raise flags. And then not only that, because of your revenue stream being limited, it's going to be a premium you're paying for, in fact, making that borrowing. So let's talk about how do you, through your view, see the country approaching the issue of closing that gap, that deficit gap?
I think that the country has to close the gap in the way in which the Minister of Finance has signaled. You have to increase revenues and you have to reduce expenditure. You have to increase revenues because you need to be able to have available to you money to run the government and also to have a social net in place for those in our society who are unable and unwilling to do better. If you don't do that, you're going to have significant issues within the society. You're going to have chaos. You're going to have social pain. And it's going to create some degree of significant instability within the framework. So you don't want that.
Identify for me then some of the areas where one can increase this revenue stream.
Property tax is one, and we've talked about that. The whole question of supporting the manufacturing sector so that they do more, using expenditure differently, that is to say, support expenditure that will give you a return and therefore contribute towards revenue. And at the same time, look at the leakages that you currently have in taxation. There are leakages in taxation in two particular areas. One is in basic collection, and the other one is in transfer pricing, where companies that do cross-border trade sometimes reduce the tax impact by doing internal pricing, which is something that if you fix it, you can get revenue streams. So there are a number of things that we can do, given the fact that you still have a large economy operating. You have a $40 billion economy still in the society, and therefore you're not without options.
When one speaks in terms, I understand the property tax, all right, we will get to that because there's some questions as to what's going to happen with that. But when you speak in terms of increasing revenue, the area, of course, of better tax collection, you have got a lot of people falling out. So that in itself, a lot of people being dislocated or dismissed or out of the workplace, that already starts playing a game with your revenue expectations, does it not?
Yes and no, because let's face it, in 2000, the country was operating on $12 billion worth of revenue. We had unemployment, we had a number of things. And the poverty number, I think at the time, was 35%. But in 2000, the country was operating. In 2016, the facts are that the jobs that we had, and some of those jobs were in fact jobs that were created because we had the resources to do so, are no longer available. If you listen to the conversation in the private sector, you are hearing that there is an absence of labor. You are hearing that in some instances they're not operating at capacity because they can't get people. Now, certainly, some of that labor that will be displaced can in fact go into other areas. The problem is going to be that whatever you are trained for today, you may not be in a position to get a job with that training, and therefore you're going to have to go somewhere else. We saw this when the Carney workers issue was being dealt with, where you had people who were basically involved in agriculture, and then they were retrenched. And what happened afterwards is that the government went into a serious retraining exercise, created new skills for them, explained to them how to produce other kinds of things. And in some instances, you were able to get some of these people going into other kinds of businesses. We, for example, in this country have a big problem with bottles and roadways and riverways that usually contribute towards flooding. That's an industry. We don't have anybody looking at it now, but certainly that could be a growth industry at the end of which two things will occur. One, we would have less of the damage to flooding because of waterways that are currently obstructed and for which there's no attention being placed to it. And therefore we could, in a sense, spend more time on the environment, fixing the environment, paying people to do that, and using in that system some of the labor that you have.